Hey everyone, my name is Dafna Lender, and I am an attachment focused therapist and trainer. And I'm here today with the lovely Karen Doyle Buckwalter, who is an expert on the clinical use of the adult attachment interview. And I'm going to chat with her today. Karen, welcome. I'm so happy to be with you.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here and have the opportunity to talk about one of my favorite subjects.
Awesome. You're one of your favorite subjects, of which you have many. So I want to just introduce you. You're, in my mind, the expert on the clinical use of all things attachment theory. And one of the things that I want to say about you is that for 30 years, you actually had the live experiment going of trying to create an attachment focused treatment program for children at the organization you worked at, Chaddock, for so many years, for 27 years. And you had so much influence on the creating an environment that was attachment focused. And I think that you were able to impact this organization and have been teaching this for so long that I literally, I think, bow down at your footsteps. That is the real deal. That is the real deal. But in addition, you've read every single book on attachment and interviewed every single person who's alive, who's a researcher, a theorist in attachment, because of the podcast that was so seminal for so many therapists, called Attachment Theory in Action. And so you're just what's housed in between your brain. I just bow down.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. And, it was an exciting partnership with Chaddock, those 30 years, many exciting things happening and learning and just constantly scanning research and what was going on with clinical models in the field and constantly looking at like what could we do to be better. And it truly was an exciting time.
Yeah. And so of all the things you really, and gosh knows you are deeply trained in a lot of things. The adult attachment interview really seized your attention, imagination, and you got deeply trained in it. And why did you pick that path?
Well, when we were moving this direction at Chaddock, and so we had been practicing at that time an attachment-based model. We were using Theraplay, we were using Dyadic developmental psychotherapy, trying to use a lot of the tools at our disposal. And one of the things that I felt perplexed by was we would have parents who were very committed. They went through a lot of trouble to get their child to Chaddock, and they were committed financially, significantly often. They were motivated. These were motivated people to try to get their child help and to try to figure out, what does our family need? And so what I was seeing though was, as motivated and committed as they were, some of the parents just could not execute, I guess I would say, therapeutic parenting or parenting in the way that we thought would help the child and the family system to function better. And so I became very curious about that. Like, what does it mean when somebody is so committed to doing something differently? And then when the time comes to do it differently, they absolutely can't. Like, what causes that?
Right.
And yeah. What's blocking them? What is the barrier to them doing it? Like they read all the books and they, had met with us and, they were in Theraplay sessions. So they were seeing different ways of interacting with their children. But when it came to the moment to be able to do some of those things on their own, something was preventing them from being able to do that. And I
Mhm.
wanted to know what it was.
Mhm. And so you stumbled upon the adult attachment interview and how the
Yeah.
attachment class.
Yeah,
Mhm.
so at the time, I was also Karen Purvis was one of we were also doing TBRI at Chaddock, and Karen Purvis had visited Chaddock numerous times, And she said, well, what I think you need to be using the adult attachment interview with the caregivers of the children that are coming into Chaddock. And I think that is going to give you a window into understanding them in a deeper way that will help you, because they had been using the adult attachment interview at her camp. And, this was before TBRI really had a name or anything like that. It was just sort of this camp where they were having adopted kids come, and in their lab, they did AAIs with all the parents. And she thought that that was really key to what they were doing. And so off I went, looked it up and registered to go to the training. It's a 2-week institute. Sometimes they call it AAI boot camp because it really is rigorous. You go to class all day and then you code interviews all night. And when you get back, and I remember calling her about 4 or 5 days in and saying, like, why did you send me to this? Like, I just, it was very detailed about a coding system. And I was really having trouble, like, wrapping my head around how is this going to help me in therapy with these parents? And they don't really teach clinical application in it either. And so there was a part of me that I was kind of frustrated and a little angry, like, what am I doing here? I don't typically do well with a lot of detail and minutia. So I was really suffering, Dafna.
I believe you, but that was the genesis for, the future of how you use this. But for people who may not be familiar, tell us, what is the adult attachment interview?
Yeah, so it's a list of questions, about 15 questions. There's follow-up probes and things like that to some of the questions. So sometimes, people will say it's like 20 questions or whatever. But basically what it is asking about a person's history of how they were parented. And through the course of asking these very specific questions, and then transcribing the interview from a recording, there is a coding system that is then applied to this transcription of the recording of the AAI that categorizes people into attachment classifications that directly relate to what that person's baby would be in the strange situation.
Okay, gosh, now there's a lot there. So before we even talk about the corresponding classification of that adult's baby in the strange situation, the 15 questions or however many is an interview that a therapist or a researcher asks the participant live, right?
Yes.
And then
Yes.
it's recorded and and transcribed, and then there's a coding system. But what is the actual mechanism? Can you say, how is it that the way a person responds to the questions reveals their attachment classification?
Yes. So, to say it sort of big picture, it's based on the level of coherence that they have in how they're responding to the interview with you. So, in a sense, like, this is a story of their relationship with their parents. And then it also goes into any losses by death of people they were close to and traumatic events they've experienced. And so they're giving you a story of this history. And many people, if they study attachment theory and attachment work, are familiar that we're a coherent autobiographical narrative is linked to, being an emotionally and psychologically healthy person as an adult. And so we're looking for the coherence of what they're telling us is the bottom line. And then we have some very specific ways that we measure coherence in the interview.
Right, coherence. And so that's really abstract, but actually the adult attachment interview has these linguistic features, Grice's maxims. Can you say a little bit and give us a couple of examples about Grice's maxims?
Yes, yes. Well, I think in terms of starting to think that way, we have remember that the AAI is coded, as you said, linguistically. So it's how you say these things, not what you say. It's right. And so that's a really different way of thinking. That's not how we like think when we're normally in a clinical situation with someone. So you could have like a really difficult past and a very horrific story that you're telling, but if you can stay coherent while you're telling it, then you could still, at the very least, be earned secure on the adult attachment interview. So it's not the content in the way we normally think of it, but rather how you say it, and just tying that to linguistics in case somebody was like wondering what that means. So that's what we mean by we're scoring it linguistically. So when Mary Main, who with her colleagues developed the adult attachment interview, she was hearing certain patterns that were coming from people in terms of how they were responding to these questions. You know, people that do this kind of research, they're brilliant at recognizing patterns, right? With babies in the strange situation or whatever they're doing, they're looking for patterning. So, and she herself had a linguistic background, and she came to realize that there were 4 things, Grice's maxims that you mentioned, that delineated, you know, who fit into what category. So the first maxim, and they're called Grice because they're named after the linguistic person that created them. Quality, be truthful and have evidence for what you say, and quantity, be succinct yet complete. Relation, be relevant to the topic, and manner, be clear and orderly. And so those are the maxims for coherent, collaborative conversation. And so we sort of look at the AAI as like a conversation. It's a structured conversation, but it is a conversation. And so, yeah, so I can give, some examples of those. But is there anything else you wanted to ask before I do that?
Yeah, why don't you give an example, just a classic example of what would be, one of the maxims that can illustrate whether it's coherent or
Right,
or
right,
not.
right. So one of the things that we have in the beginning of the AAI is we ask for 5 adjectives that describe your childhood relationship with your parent, with your mother, your father, or whoever is identified as the people who raised you. And when they give those 5 adjectives, we then go back and say, could you give a specific incident or an example of why you chose that adjective? So if the person, chooses, loving and reliable, and let's just say that was 2 of the 5, I'm going to go back and I'm going to ask them, can you give me a specific incident? And if a person can't, they might say, well, for loving, I don't know, like it's really hard to say. Like I just felt like she loved me. Okay, then that would be a violation of quality, because they're not, the first one, be truthful and have evidence for what you say. That's not really convincing evidence for what they're saying. And so we would go through these different these different adjectives that they gave us, and see if they had evidence for each adjective that they gave us. Or maybe somewhere in the interview we ask a question about losses or something, and they go completely off on a tangent that has nothing to do with losses. Remember, we're asking very specific questions. So then we might see a violation of relation. They're saying stuff that has nothing to do with what we're talking about.
Right.
Um, so we in the different classifications, there tends to be certain violations in each of these. Like for example, if somebody is preoccupied, one of the classifications in the AAI, they tend to violate manner, it's hard to follow what they're saying. It's kind of going on and on. They also would violate relation, like, wait a minute, like, what are they even talking about? Like, you'll find yourself feeling like, wait, what did I even ask them? Because it's not staying. They violate quantity because the interview is so long. It just goes on and on and on, versus somebody who is dismissing on the adult attachment interview. Their answers tend to be like short and brief, and they're violating quantity, the maximum quantity, the other direction.
Mhm.
Like, they're kind of not telling me enough. Like, I feel
Right.
like they're holding out on me. Like, they're giving me these like one word answers or really short answers. So these different maxims, and whether or not they're violated, which sounds kind of funny because it feels like we're talking about them backwards. But the way we think about it when we go into an adult attachment interview is, assume the person is secure until proven otherwise. And when they're proven otherwise, part of the way they prove otherwise is violating these maxims.
Okay. Well, so the interview is something that might take an hour and a quarter. But how is it that if a person isn't trained in coding the AI and isn't doing it for research, how is it useful? How have you found it useful? You've developed a whole course on it, so you definitely have shown it to be very useful and popular. The using this structured interview for planning, clinical treatment or for the relationship that you develop with the client?
Yes, yes. So, I mean, I would say first at a macro level, big picture level, one of the things that's so beautiful about this interview and this assessment is it allows someone to tell a story in a way that it's never been told before. So, that right there is really significant, because you can listen to this interview clinically and you're hearing a story that's just, it's been pulled from this person. Mary Main said it would, the AAI would surprise the unconscious. So I often feel like when they're responding to me in the adult attachment interview, and this is really important clinically, what I'm going to say, they're telling me essential, important information that they could not tell me otherwise.
Mm, but they could not tell you otherwise. That's really important.
Yes,
Mm,
yes. Because, and even within the interview, they may not almost even be aware that they're telling me it. But because I have this very specific way of understanding the interview and listening to the interview, that's a different way than I would typically listen. It does reveal things that are information and an understanding that can't be obtained in any other way. So that's like kind of like the big picture part of it. And then in terms of more micro, and some of what we talk about in the course is, you listening and understanding Grice's maxims and some of the other hallmarks of each of these classifications. Um, I think that knowing some of those, for example, we have a word that we call in the coding system derogation, and derogating the attachment relationship. And somebody that is, I guess we didn't go over all four classifications, but we have secure autonomous, and we have dismissing, and we have preoccupied, and then we have disorganized, which would be unresolved with regard to loss for the adult classifications. And then they correspond to, the classifications in the strange situation for a baby. And so I think that you can understand some of the important things to listen to about each of these classifications, and that will give you insight into the person's classification. But not even so much that, like, I don't want anyone to think they can take this course and then that I give and then say, oh, you're dismissing, or you're this, or you're that. I think what's more important is the story that comes out and the very specific things someone tells you that are consistent or inconsistent with what you knew before. And then you can use pieces of that story clinically, and understand that person in a different way. The thing about the adult attachment interview is it's been used a lot in research, and researchers look for sameness. Like they're wanting to put someone in a box.
Mhm.
We look for nuance and subtle differences in people. So we don't need to be able to put them in a box, but we need to tease out the nuance and the subtle differences of their story that are important for us to understand in a deep way. And
Right, right.
yeah, and the AAI lets us do that.
Yes, yeah. And and so just to wrap up, I think one of the things that you've always told me, which I use it to some degree, a little modified, is the importance of how much empathy you develop for a parent when it's their child who's ostensibly coming into treatment. But you
Right.
want to work with a parent and child together. And so when you are able to understand their history in this really, really rich way, you start to feel differently about them. You feel very close to them.
You absolutely do. And I think that, for listeners who work with children and adults, it's easy to have compassion for children. And sometimes we become frustrated with the parents that we're working with. Like, come on, you're the grown up, get with it here. And but the important thing to remember is that if we have a parent and we have a child, if the child has a history of trauma and attachment disruptions, we might be thinking, oh, there's just this wounded baby inside this child. But there's often also a wounded baby inside the adult. And when we can understand the story of their own wounds and hold both of those stories, hold the story of the child and hold the story of the parent with equal compassion and empathy. I mean, that doesn't mean that we don't recognize that the child does not have the same power as the adult or whatever, but having compassion and empathy for both sides of the story, it changes everything. It changes all the moves that I make in a therapy session holding that.
Wow. Okay. Well, I think we should end with that note of remembering that if you hold the parent's story, then it changes all the moves that you make in your clinical decision making and the attitude that you take to make it so much richer of a therapy process, which
Yes.
includes the parent so powerfully. Yeah, and that's why I love what you're doing so much, Karen.
Thank
So I
you.
really appreciate you. And yeah, check out Karen's training on the clinical use of the adult attachment interview. Where can they find you?
So for my website is karendoylebuckwalter.com, and then my workshops are, if you search me plus Eventbrite, that's where you will see my AAI workshops. I have one coming up in May and one in September. I usually do a spring and a fall one. So yeah, that would be where they could find those.
Okay. Thank you so much, Karen Doyle Buckwalter. It's been wonderful to hear about this and your work.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been wonderful to talk about this.